Jon Snow stood in the great hall of the Red Keep, the flickering torches casting dancing shadows on the walls. His posture was rigid, and his dark eyes, so often thoughtful, were now grim with an uneasy determination. The hush that fell over those assembled was absolute. It was as though the entire castle had exhaled one collective breath and refused to draw another. Word had spread that Jon Snow, newly revealed to be Aegon Targaryen, the rightful heir to the Iron Throne, intended to make a fateful decision about his once-beloved queen, Daenerys Targaryen. She was not standing by his side as she once had in the north. She was not standing before him in deference. She was nowhere in the great hall at all. Instead, she stood outside, waiting. With a look of quiet rage she tried to conceal beneath a mask of dignity. The lords and ladies gathered in the hall were uncertain if the rumor was true, that Jon Snow would banish Daenerys from Westeros altogether. In fact, many among the assembled crowd could not quite fathom it. Had the Dragon Queen not been the conqueror of the city? Had she not been the breaker of chains to thousands? Yet, she had also become the destroyer of King's Landing. The scars of dragonfire still marred the streets. The smell of soot and ash lingered even months later. Tensions across the realm were high, and people whispered that too much blood had been spilled for one woman's thirst for power. Yet was it her thirst, or was it the rightful vengeance of a queen who had suffered betrayal after betrayal? No one could decide, but it was Jon Aegon, now wearing the weight of the crown, who must pass judgment. When Jon finally ascended the steps of the dais, the hush deepened. He swallowed, feeling that old lump in his throat, that sense that he was never supposed to be here, never meant to be the one passing such judgments. He thought of Ned Stark then, of the father who had raised him, who had taught him that the man who passes the sentence must swing the sword. He had tried to live by those words, but what sword could possibly do justice to the complexities of this moment? He gazed at the hall. Lined along the walls were knights from houses that had somehow survived the wars. House Tyrell was gone, House Martell in tatters. The Baratheons had no true heir but Gendry. So many houses had been reduced to husks or had shifted their loyalties, changing hands as quickly as gold dragons in a tavern. And the lords who remained, Lord Royce of the Vale, Lord Glover of Deepwood Motte, even the reluctant presence of Tyrion Lannister, stood with wide eyes, awaiting the new king's words. It was Tyrion, ironically, who spoke first. "Your Grace," he said softly, his voice echoing in the stillness. "Have you made your decision?" Jon's throat felt dry. He nodded. "Bring her in," he commanded, his voice carrying more certainty than he felt. Two Kingsguard in white cloaks dipped their heads and stepped outside. A moment later, Daenerys Targaryen, flanked by those same white-cloaked knights, entered. The hush remained absolute. She walked with a regal bearing, chin high, silver gold hair braided behind her. Though the days of her being followed by an army of unsullied were past, the defiance in her violet eyes had not diminished. She wore a simple dress of black and red, the colors of House Targaryen. Over her shoulders lay a cloak embroidered with the three-headed dragon. She looked neither left nor right, only straight ahead, and she did not bow. The watchers hardly dared to breathe. Jon had rehearsed what he would say, but the sight of her made everything unravel. Memories washed over him. Her tears at the loss of Ser Jorah, her fierce conviction at the battle against the dead, the gentleness he had felt from her when they had first shared a night's warmth on a cold northern evening. Yet he recalled all the destruction she had unleashed during her final assault. He remembered the children's bodies in the charred streets, the broken city walls, the souls who had fled from dragonfire only to find their houses collapsing upon them. The truth weighed on his heart, demanded that he act. He had to force himself to speak. "Daenerys Stormborn of House Targaryen," he said, the formal words echoing in the hall. "You stand before the Iron Throne that once was yours to claim by right of blood. But the throne has cost this realm too dearly. Your methods of claiming it have broken the peace that we have sought for so long." Her eyes flickered with anger. "The peace was broken long before I arrived," she replied softly. "And you know that." Jon grimaced. "I do, but you made it worse. The city burned beneath your dragon's flames. Innocent people died. They had surrendered, Daenerys. You had won. Yet still you burned them. How do I let that stand? Her gaze did not falter, though her voice quivered with emotion. I did what I believed necessary. Cersei used the city's people as shields, and I made a judgment to end the war. Were my methods cruel? Perhaps they were. But no cruelty compares to the cost of continuing a war that would never end if mercy were mistaken for weakness. Jon's heart pounded. He knew these arguments were old, repeated, thrashed over in council and whispered in dark corners. Many times he had tried to see her side, to find a path to forgiveness. But the memory of the dead still haunted him. He paused, letting silence linger in that vast hall. He could feel the eyes of the realm upon him. At last, he spoke with the voice of a man carrying all the burdens of the Seven Kingdoms. There will be no execution, he said, so quietly at first that people strained to hear. I cannot kill you, nor can I keep you here. A ripple of confusion passed among the onlookers. Daenerys's lips parted in disbelief. She had anticipated death. She had steeled herself for the executioner's sword, or perhaps the headman's axe. She had considered trying to fight back, but even her last dragon, Drogon, was far away, flown off who knew where, perhaps mourning the death of his siblings and the destruction of his mother's ambitions. She was almost prepared to die in that hall, but exile? Jon, she breathed, so quietly that only those nearest the dais could hear. What are you doing? He closed his eyes momentarily. Then he lifted his chin. By the power vested in me as king of the Undulls, the Rhoynar, and the First Men, he said, I banish you, Daenerys Targaryen, from the Seven Kingdoms. You are to take no armies, no dragons, no claim. Your titles here are null. You will not be welcomed in any castle or city. If you remain, you will face the king's justice. If you ever return without my leave, you will be executed. A buzzing murmur broke through the crowd. Some were outraged at the leniency. Others were stunned that he would dare to part so drastically from her. Grey Worm, had he still been standing guard over her, might have drawn his spear. But Grey Worm was gone, set sail with the Unsullied toward Noth, fulfilling Missandei's last wish. The queen was alone. A hush overtook them all again as Daenerys stepped forward. She did not kneel, she did not cry, she did not fling wild curses. She held Jon's gaze, and within her eyes lay a storm of emotions. Heartbreak, betrayal, indignation, and something deeper that only she herself might have understood. You betray your own blood, she said, her voice trembling with control. We are Targaryens, you and I. The dragon is in our blood. This was our kingdom, and you hand it over to the ones who betrayed me. You will come to regret this, Aegon Targaryen. Westeros will regret this. Jon said nothing. Her condemnation was something he expected. Better her hatred than to watch the realm descend into another cycle of vengeance. Better her exile than to plunge the kingdoms into an endless war of retribution. She turned away, her cloak sweeping behind her, and walked down the echoing length of the great hall. The guards parted for her. The crowd parted too. She had no army, no power to resist. Yet everyone who looked at her face understood she still carried her fiery will. And so Daenerys Targaryen left the Red Keep in silence. In the following days, talk spread like wildfire across King's Landing and beyond. Some thought the new king foolish. Others thought him merciful. Many were simply thankful that an end to bloodshed might be in sight. But Daenerys Targaryen's departure from the city did not mark the end of her influence. Far from it. She disappeared from the Crownlands swiftly, traveling with only a handful of loyal followers who had clung to her side after the battle for King's Landing. She had no large retinue anymore. Many Unsullied had left. The Dothraki, or what remained of them, had scattered in confusion after the city fell. She was left with a ragged band of freefolk from Essos, a few Sellswords who believed she might still reclaim power, and those who refused to abandon the Dragon Queen they had followed across the sea. News came back, drifting in through whispers in taverns and travelers on the Rose Road, that Daenerys had taken a ship from Maidenpool. People spoke of her calm as she boarded, the way her silver hair flew in the sea breeze. No one knew precisely where she planned to go. Some said she was sailing east, perhaps back to Meereen or beyond. Others claimed she would head south to Dorne, risk a clandestine alliance with the scattered Martell sympathizers. But no one knew for sure. For a time, it was as though the queen vanished into the mists. Jon Snow, King Aegon, though he still thought of himself more as Jon, settled into his unwanted role. The Iron Throne itself had been melted by dragonfire, so what remained in the Red Keep was a new seat, fashioned out of the melted remnants of swords, hammered into a simpler and humbler throne. He hated it. He hated the pomp, yet he strove to bring peace. Tyrion Lannister served as his hand, though it took every ounce of persuasion to keep the dwarf from simply leaving to drink himself into oblivion. Davos Seaworth acted as master of ships. Ser Brienne of Tarth guarded the king's life, wearing a new white cloak as Lord Commander of the Kingsguard. Samwell Tarly acted as Grand Maester. The small council was small indeed, but Jon trusted them. They had all sacrificed too much to allow the realm to crumble. In those initial months, King Aegon's rule was precarious. The lords of the realm accepted his kingship, some grudgingly, some with relief. After all, the realm had grown weary of constant war. It yearned for stability. The North recognized him as a Stark by upbringing, a Targaryen by blood, though it was Lady Sansa Stark who now ruled Winterfell in all but name. The Vale, guided by Lord Royce, was still reeling from the war but had made no move to oppose Jon. Gendry Baratheon, legitimized by royal decree earlier by Daenerys herself, now served as Lord Paramount of the Stormlands with an uneasy loyalty. The Iron Islands had all but declared their own independence the moment Euron Greyjoy died, though Yara Greyjoy had formed a tenuous alliance with the new king. The Reach was in chaos, leaderless, with minor lords jockeying for the Tyrell seat. Dorne was a silent question mark. The Martell line had been all but extinguished, but local lords still had pride, and they resented any king's rule from the Red Keep. The realm was held together by fraying threads. Yet for a few tenuous months it seemed a new dawn might be possible, until word arrived that Daenerys Targaryen had returned to Essos, mustering forces in Volantis. No one was certain how she managed it, but the rumors were enough to sow fear. Some said she courted the Red Priests of R'hllor, speaking of a grand destiny. Others whispered that Drogon had found her in Essos, that the huge black dragon had bent its will to her once more. None knew for certain, but letters arrived in King's Landing from agents in the Free Cities, telling of new Sellsword companies pledged to the rightful queen of the Seven Kingdoms. The Golden Company had been shattered in the last war, but other companies abounded. Men sold their blades for gold, and Daenerys had access to wealth from the east if she reclaimed the old networks she had established as the breaker of chains. Jon read these reports with mounting dread. If Daenerys was building an army, that could only mean one thing. She intended to return to Westeros. The thought of war tearing the realm apart again gave him sleepless nights. He wandered the Red Keep's corridors at night, haunted by visions of dragonfire and the dreadful memory of the living battling the dead in the north. He would wander until dawn if he let himself, always hoping for another solution. Tyrion urged him to prepare. "If she's gathering forces, Your Grace," Tyrion would say with a weary sigh, "she won't sit idle. She has cause for vengeance, and she's not the type to let a banishment stand." Tyrion's voice was thick with regret, perhaps also with guilt, for he, too, had been complicit in the destruction of King's Landing by standing at Daenerys' side for so long. "We must shore up alliances. Gendry must be brought closer. The Vale must commit knights. The North must send men. Dorne may remain a thorn in your side, but we cannot afford to leave them unswayed. We should send ambassadors." Jon listened but found no joy in the plan. He sent ravens, made alliances with half-hearted courtesy. Sansa in Winterfell answered that she would hold the North secure, but that the cost in lives up there meant she could ill afford to send her full strength. Gendry answered promptly with a willingness to muster in Storm's End, proud to serve the friend who had once fought the White Walkers with him. Yara Greyjoy's reply was far colder. but she refrained from outright rebellion. The Vale was silent, mostly because young Lord Robin Arryn's health was in question. Lord Royce commanded in his stead, but the Vale's knights were battered from the war against the dead and the battle for King's Landing. And so the realm stood on edge, months stretching into a year, each day bringing fresh rumors of Daenerys' doings across the narrow sea. The king's small council debated ways to soothe the realm or strengthen it. Rebuilding King's Landing from the ashes took time. Most of the small folk, exhausted by war, simply wanted to tend their fields and feed their families. But an undercurrent of tension ran through the taverns, the markets, the seaports. Whispers circulated that the true queen had been exiled unfairly, that she alone had freed the people in Essos, that she alone had ended the White Walker threat with her dragons in the north. Others whispered back that the king was the rightful heir, that the queen had gone mad with Targaryen fury, that she had butchered innocents. Each whisper threatened to tear the fragile peace asunder. Daenerys' first open move came by sea. A fleet sailed from Volantis under black and red sails bearing the dragon sigil. At its head was a trio of formidable warships said to be of Braavosi make, outfitted with Scorpion ballistae on their decks. Word reached Jon through the Ragman's harbor at King's Landing that Daenerys was sighted near Dragonstone's waters. She had not ventured close enough to test the newly built defenses of King's Landing's bay, but the message was clear. She had returned to Westeros. And with her arrived the rumor that Drogon had flown overhead, his roars echoing across the sea. Jon gathered his council, the lords, and knights who could offer any form of strategic advice. Tyrion, Davos, Brienne, and a host of smaller lords packed into the old council chamber. The painted table from Dragonstone had been transported to the capital after the war, so that the king could survey the realm in more detail. Now Jon stood over that table, looking at the carved outline of Westeros, thinking of all the men who had stood around it before him. Stannis Baratheon, Daenerys herself, men who had dreamed of conquest or rightful rule. The irony weighed on him. Tyrion gestured at the figure representing Dragonstone. "She's surely making that her base of operations," he said, tapping his finger on the carved island. "It's the ancestral seat of House Targaryen, and you didn't have the resources to garrison it heavily, not while trying to rebuild the city." Jon nodded grimly. "So she's taken it without a fight." He looked to Davos. "How well can we defend Blackwater Bay?" Davos frowned. "We're building new ships. The royal fleet's stronger now than it was when Euron Greyjoy prowled these waters. But if Daenerys is bringing a full Volantene fleet, or if she's bribed the Triarchs of Volantis, then we might be outnumbered. A naval battle with a dragon overhead. It'll be bloody, Your Grace." Jon rubbed a hand over his face. He recalled all the times Daenerys had said that fear was her ally, that dragons made men's knees tremble. "We can't defeat a dragon easily, even with scorpions," he said. "That's proved to be the truth. One well-aimed shot can do it, but that's luck, not strategy. And she has time on her side. She can starve the city if she wishes." Tyrion's expression was grave. "She might, though that would turn more small folk against her if she caused a siege. And she always saw herself as a liberator. Perhaps that part of her still remains. But war changes people." Brienne stood straight-backed, arms folded. "We should call banners from the north and from the Stormlands," she said. "Defend the capital if it comes to that. A quick show of strength may dissuade her from an outright attack." Jon gave a weary sigh. "We'll make the calls, but war is the last thing I want," he said. "I'm not sure Dany can be reasoned with, but perhaps I can try. We have a history." The king's voice was almost a whisper. He hated to think about that history, the love that had existed between them, the heartbreak of betrayal. But if there was even a shred of hope to avoid more bloodshed, he had to try. Tyrion's eyes flickered with sympathy. "It's a risk, but it may be the only chance to avoid a second dance of dragons. We could attempt a parley." They planned the parley in secret. A single ship, flying a white flag, would sail to Dragonstone carrying Jon, Tyrion, and a small guard. They would request a meeting on neutral ground, perhaps on a beach or a cove near Dragonstone, where they could speak with Daenerys and see if any compromise was possible. The risk of violence was high, but perhaps not as high as an all-out war. When the day of the parley arrived, the sea lay calm under a wan sky. A quiet hush fell over the small, swift vessel carrying the king. Ser Brienne stood at Jon's side, hand resting on the pommel of her long sword. Tyrion paced at the bow, eyes scanning the horizon. The men at the oars rowed with silent discipline, well aware of the tension. Ahead, Dragonstone's ancient towers rose from the volcanic rock, shaped like dragons in flight. The fortress seemed half alive in the gloom, cloaked in swirling sea mist. They saw the approaching silhouette of a single longboat from Dragonstone, carrying a handful of figures. At the front was a tall, lean man wearing a black cloak, and at the stern sat a woman. Even from a distance, the white-haired figure was unmistakable. Daenerys had come. She had risked the parley too. The two boats met in a stretch of shallow water near the coastline, well away from the scorpions that might line Dragonstone's battlements. Gulls cried overhead, and the smell of brine filled the air. Each side eyed the other warily. When they found a stretch of beach, they disembarked, leaving most of the guards behind. Jon, Tyrion, and Brienne stepped onto the wet sand. Daenerys approached with 3 figures. 2 were mercenaries by their lieu. Armed, lean, faces hardened by violence. The third was a woman robed in red, her face veiled. A red priestess, Tyrion realized with alarm. The shadows in her hooded eyes flickered at the sight of them. Jon and Daenerys stood across from each other, the sand stretching in a wide strip between them. Memories swelled in Jon's mind, memories of her soft smile, the warmth of her eyes, the shared nights in Winterfell. He tried to banish these ghosts. He saw only the queen who had burned King's Landing, the queen he had exiled. She, in turn, saw the man she had loved, the man who had betrayed her, who had taken her throne, and banished her from her birthright. Neither spoke at first. The wind tugged at Daenerys' silver hair. She wore simple black leathers, a red cloak swirling about her. She carried no crown, no ornaments. Still, there was regal poise in her bearing. Drogon was nowhere in sight, but the possibility that the dragon might be lurking nearby hung like a specter over everyone present. At last, Daenerys' voice broke the silence. "You came," a statement more than a question, her words laced with a hint of surprise. Jon's throat was tight. "We want to avoid bloodshed. This realm has seen enough death." She laughed without mirth. "You think I desire more war? That was never my wish. I wanted a kingdom free of tyrants. I wanted a new beginning." Tyrion ventured forward, hands raised in a gesture of peace. "Your Grace," he said carefully, addressing Daenerys by the title he once used. "Surely there is another way. We've both fought wars. We've both lost too many. King Aegon, Jon, wants to find a peaceful resolution." Daenerys' eyes flickered to Tyrion, then away. "A peaceful resolution? He exiled me from my own kingdom. He made me a beggar in Essos once more. But I'm not so easily subdued. I have loyal supporters, and I have Drogon. If you truly want peace, you will restore my throne." Jon felt the lump in his throat again. "I can't do that. Your method of ruling the city proved catastrophic. The lords and small folk alike won't accept you. I've tried to keep the realm from shattering. If you come at the head of an army, you'll plunge Westeros into chaos again." She shook her head. "You speak of chaos, but it was your betrayal." And here her voice rose, thick with emotion. "That cost us everything. We had the city. We had the throne. And you stabbed me in the heart with your doubt. You chose them over me." Jon's face burned. The weight of guilt pressed on him. "I had to choose the realm," he said quietly. "I lost you in doing so." Daenerys' expression turned guarded. "Then we have nothing left to say." She stepped back, a silent signal that the conversation was ending before it truly began. Tyrion quickly interjected. "Your Grace, I beg you reconsider. The realm is tired. Our people are exhausted. Surely we can find some arrangement. A compromise that respects your birthright without forcing a war." Her eyes snapped to Tyrion, cold and bright. "What arrangement would that be, dwarf?" that I serve under him, that I act as his regent or share the throne. The 7 kingdoms cannot have 2 monarchs. History has proven that, and I will not be satisfied with a corner of the realm. I was born to rule the 7 kingdoms. That truth was burned into my soul. Jon tried one final plea. Dany. The use of her nickname made her flinch, but he pressed on. I told you before, I never wanted the throne. The people chose me after what happened in King's Landing. I only want them safe. I only want peace. She regarded him with a faint sadness. Then abdicate. Bend the knee to me as you once did. Jon closed his eyes, the sea breeze ruffling his cloak. He knew that was impossible. Even if he did, the realm would never accept it without fresh conflict. And he had promised himself never to be the cause of more bloodshed if he could help it. But could he truly hold onto a crown if it meant a new war? He looked at her and saw no compromise in her gaze. The Daenerys he had loved was gone, or perhaps consumed by the same fierce will that had always burned within her. That I cannot do, he finally said. She inclined her head, an acknowledgement of the finality. Then we are at an impasse. She turned to leave, her mercenaries following, the Red Priestess lingering for a moment. The veiled woman looked upon Jon, her eyes shining with an odd light, as if searching for something. Then she too turned and walked away. It was over in moments. No swords were drawn, no blood was spilled on that bleak shore, but the war was as good as declared. When Jon returned to King's Landing, he convened his council at once. The letter he sent to every major lord was urgent. Daenerys Targaryen had returned, intent on claiming the throne by force if necessary. All men who wished to preserve the realm from dragonfire must gather under King Aegon's banner, or the entire 7 kingdoms risked a new devastation. The raven's sword from the Red Keep's rookery, black shadows on a stormy sky, carrying words that would divide the realm once more. In the months that followed, a complicated tapestry of alliances began to form. Some lords, enthralled by Daenerys' earlier victories and convinced that she was the rightful ruler, openly defected to her cause. Small houses mostly, but some not so small. Others, fearing the fury of dragonfire, remained loyal to Jon, trusting his Stark upbringing and the calm rule he had tried to establish. Still others took a wait-and-see approach, barricading themselves in their strongholds, reluctant to commit. All the while, Daenerys consolidated Dragonstone, building a power base. Fleets bearing her sigil-harried shipping lines, capturing merchant vessels and building their own supply lines. Agents rumored to be aligned with the Red Temple of Volantis spread throughout the realm, whispering that Daenerys was the chosen one to cleanse the realm of tyrants. Jon faced each day with a mix of resolve and dread. He consulted Tyrion, who outlined strategies to contain Daenerys' forces on Dragonstone. He conferred with Davos, who tried to bolster the royal fleet. He relied on Brienne for training new recruits to the Kingsguard. Yet all of it felt like staving off a storm with a wooden shield. He could sense her presence, that unstoppable determination she had carried since he first met her. It bore down upon him across the sea, a looming threat as certain as the turning of the seasons. The first real clash came off the coast of Driftmark. A portion of Jon's royal fleet, commanded by Davos in person, encountered a smaller detachment of Daenerys' forces. The skirmish was brief but brutal. War galleys fired scorpion bolts at each other. Men boarded in savage hand-to-hand combat, the shrieks of the wounded carrying across the waves. Davos proved himself again the Onion Knight, using cunning and skill to outmaneuver the enemy. Yet the presence of Drogon, even at a distance, changed everything. With a roar and a gust of scorching flame, the Black Dragon set fire to 2 of Jon's ships before Davos managed a retreat. It was a demonstration of raw power, a message Daenerys sent to the king. She held the advantage of the dragon. The news of this victory spread, and with it, Daenerys' ranks swelled. More mercenaries trickled in from the free cities, drawn by the prospect of plunder or the glamour of serving a Targaryen queen. Discontented lords in Westeros found a rallying cry: fire and blood. Old resentments flared, especially in regions that had suffered under Lannister or Baratheon rule. Some said the Dragon Queen would bring an era of justice. Others said it was pure madness to side with a woman who had already burned a city. Yet more and more swords were raised in her name. Jon held council after council, trying to maintain a stable government while also coordinating the defense. Winter was not over, though the worst of it had passed, and supply lines remained tenuous. The small folk struggled with harvests in scorched fields around King's Landing. Rebuilding efforts continued, but now workers were drafted to bolster fortifications, to erect scorpions along the battlements, to set up watchers in the hills near the city. Within the Red Keep, a sense of impending doom hung like a pall, and far away in the north, Sansa Stark wrestled with her own difficult choices. She had sworn to support Jon, but the North remembered the burning of Winterfell's supplies, the losses to the White Walkers, the endless wars. Many northern lords were not eager to march south again. They had lost too many men against the dead, then in the capital. Still, out of loyalty to the king, small contingents were sent south, trickling down the King's Road. Sansa herself pondered whether to ride with them, but she knew the North needed stable leadership. Torn, she tried to balance her loyalty to Jon with her desire to keep her people safe. The northern banners moved slowly, if at all. All across the Seven Kingdoms, a quiet dread sank in as the two Targaryen claimants prepared for a war that none wanted but all felt was inevitable. People remembered how the dance of the dragons generations ago had almost destroyed House Targaryen. Now that history threatened to repeat itself with Jon Aegon and Daenerys each claiming the right to the Iron Throne. The swords of the realm were sharpening, the ravens carrying missives from lord to lord, forging alliances or betrayals. As summer threatened to come, the warmth of peace seemed ever out of reach. The specter of civil war loomed like a dark cloud over Westeros. The day came when Daenerys made her move. A beacon fire on Dragonstone signaled the departure of her fleet. Reports came in from fishermen and scouts that the sails were black and red, numerous enough to darken the horizon. Jon ordered immediate defensive measures. The gates of King's Landing closed. The scorpions were manned. Knights patrolled the walls. Civilians were advised to hide or evacuate. Many remembered the last time the city came under dragon attack and trembled in fear. Daenerys's fleet drew near. Jon stood atop the walls near the Red Keep, gazing seaward. He could see the mass of ships, see the occasional flash of a black wing high in the clouds. Drogon circled overhead, a menacing shape against the pale sky. His roars rolled across the bay, a harbinger of destruction. Jon's mouth was dry. Tyrion stood beside him, silent and grim, a chain of office glinting on his chest. Brienne stood on Jon's other side, calm and resolute, her white cloak stirring in the sea breeze. No bombardment came at once. Instead, from the lead ship, a single boat was lowered. Daenerys, brazenly, once again sought parley. This time, she landed on the shore near the city's battered gates. From the ramparts, Jon watched as she stepped onto the sand. She was accompanied by a handful of her men and that same Red Priestess. Drogon wheeled overhead, a silent threat, though he did not descend. Her war fleet lingered in the deeper waters, forming a blockade. The city was effectively sealed from the sea. Jon turned to Tyrion. "Stay up here," he ordered quietly. "I'll go down with a guard to hear her terms. If she's come to talk, I have to give it one last chance." Tyrion hesitated, then nodded. "Be careful." Jon descended with a company of guardsmen in battered armor. They marched out past the newly fortified gates onto the open stretch of ground near the shoreline. The wind whipped at Jon's cloak, the memory of the last parley replaying in his mind. But the stakes were higher now. He had no illusions that she would let him walk away so easily if this went sour. They met on a patch of beach still marred by old scorch marks from the previous war. Daenerys stood tall, her cloak snapping behind her, the Red Priestess at her side. A handful of Sellsword captains, grim-looking men with exotic tattoos, flanked her. Jon could almost taste the tension in the air. She did not bother with pleasantries. "Surrender the city," she said, her voice carrying easily over the wind. "Open the gates, let my army enter, and bend the knee once and for all. If you do, I swear by the Lord of Light, no more blood will be shed. I will be merciful. The city will be spared dragonfire." Jon's face set in a hard line. "I can't. The people have chosen to follow me. The lords gave me their fealty. I'm king in name, but it's for them, not for my own glory. You ask me to surrender their loyalty without a fight." The Red Priestess lifted her hands. "The Lord of Light stands behind the Mother of Dragons," she intoned. "She is the chosen flame, the breaker of night. All who oppose her stand in darkness." Daenerys nodded in agreement, her gaze never leaving Jon. "I gave you every chance, Jon. I loved you. I would have shared the throne with you if you had only kept your loyalty to me. But now I cannot. The city is mine by rights. I will not see it slip away." Jon clenched his jaw. "People will die if you force an assault. Innocent people." Her eyes flickered. "War always has a price. I have tried to minimize it. Surrender, and that price will be small. Resist, and the 7 kingdoms will burn again." Jon's frustration flared. "What happened to breaking the wheel? How many thousands must die in your pursuit of power?" She bristled. "This was never about power for its own sake. The wheel you speak of has never been truly broken. The lords still oppress the people. The old families cling to tradition. The small folk starve. My path is the only way to usher in lasting change. I offered you a place in that new world, but you spurned me." Jon saw the flash of fanaticism in her eyes. He remembered the gentle Daenerys, the one who freed slaves, the one who cared for the downtrodden. Now all he saw was unwavering conviction. "If you truly cared for the people," he said quietly, "you would not threaten them with fire and blood again." Her face remained impassive. "I gave you my terms. Will you surrender?" Her eyes flicked to the ramparts behind Jon, where scorpions and archers stood. She was ready for war if he refused. Jon inhaled slowly, then exhaled. The choice was impossible. If he surrendered, the realm would see him as a weak king who abandoned his duty. If he fought, thousands more would die in a war that might ravage the land. Yet he knew Daenerys's fervor. Even if she won, the cost would be unspeakable. He steeled himself. "I cannot surrender the throne that was given to me. If you attack, we will defend ourselves." Her expression was unreadable. Then, almost sadly, she nodded. "So be it. When next we meet, I will take your throne by fire and blood." She signaled her retinue, and they turned to head back to the boats. The Red Priestess spared Jon a final glance, as though trying to see into his soul, before following her queen. Jon returned to the city, burdened by a new wave of dread. War was now certain. A handful of watchers from the ramparts saw Daenerys' small party row back to the flagship. The blockade tightened around the bay, cutting off supplies. Within hours, the Red Keep's couriers confirmed that Daenerys had stationed troops on the roads south of King's Landing, intercepting merchants and travelers, thereby imposing a stranglehold. Tensions soared as days bled into nights under the looming threat of a siege. While Jon prepared for a direct assault, Daenerys' plan became more apparent. She was forcing the capital into desperation. Her ships cut off trade, her sellswords patrolled the surrounding countryside, and the presence of Drogon overhead kept everyone awake with fear. With each passing day, the small folk grew hungrier. Whispers of dissatisfaction began to swirl. This king was letting them starve. Why not let the Dragon Queen back in? Some said she had promised mercy. Others remembered the scorched ruins from before. Still, desperation breeds forgetfulness, and the idea of open gates, of an end to the blockade, gained traction among the weary populace. Jon held council with Tyrion daily, discussing how to break the blockade or secure food from the Riverlands. But the Riverlands had been ravaged by the wars, and House Frey was no longer stable to help or hinder. Lady Brienne led scouting parties outside the city walls, sometimes clashing with Daenerys' outriders. Skirmishes flared. Prisoners were taken. Each day the tension thickened, At last came the day Daenerys unleashed Drogon upon the fields outside the city. In the late afternoon, watchers from the battlements saw the great black shape dive from the clouds, breathing fire upon the stockpiles of grain that had been earmarked for the city's inhabitants. Flames rose in an inferno that licked the sky, and smoke drifted over the walls. In that single fiery act, Daenerys sent a grim message. She would starve the city into surrender if necessary. Fear turned to anger within King's Landing. The memory of the last conflagration still fresh in people's minds. Many saw no path to peace unless one side or the other yielded. Some called for an uprising within the city, forcing Jon to surrender or face rebellion from his own people. Others shouted for the heads of any who would conspire with the Dragon Queen. Street fights broke out, tension seethed, and the fragile unity within the walls began to crumble. Jon and Tyrion recognized the danger. They had to act or lose the city from within. It was then that an unexpected messenger arrived under a white banner. A representative from Dorne, a woman who called herself Lady Nymella Corgyle, strode into the Red Keep's audience chamber, escorted by a handful of Dornish spearmen. The tension in the air crackled as she bowed before King Aegon. "Your Grace," said Lady Nymella, her accent heavy with Dornish inflections. "Dorne wishes to remain independent of this war, but we will not stand idly by while a Targaryen queen once again threatens to burn the realm. We offer our aid on our terms." Tyrion eyed her warily. "And what terms would those be?" The Dornish woman smiled. "Dorne has fought dragons before. We know how to kill them if it comes to that. Our scorpions have been improved upon designs from history. We offer them to you. In exchange, if you prevail, you will grant Dorne full autonomy. No taxes, no forced fealty." Jon exchanged glances with Tyrion. Dorne's help would be invaluable, especially against Drogon. But the cost would be high. Still, what choice did they have if they wanted to keep the realm from burning? "We need time to consider," Jon said. Lady Nymella gave a slight inclination of her head. "You have until the city falls, Your Grace. I'll be staying at an inn just outside the gates. Send word when you have decided." She departed, leaving Jon and Tyrion to pace in heavy silence. Tyrion eventually spoke, his voice laced with resignation. "We may need Dorne's help. If Daenerys unleashes Drogon fully on the city, we'll have no chance." Jon rubbed his forehead. The notion of forging an alliance that effectively broke the Seven Kingdoms weighed on him. But letting Daenerys continue to ravage the countryside was unacceptable. "Dorne's independence might be the price to save the realm," he murmured. "But if we let one kingdom secede, others may follow. The realm could splinter." Tyrion's eyes were haunted. Better a splintered realm than a field of ashes. The next day, Jon met again with Lady Nymella. He agreed, in principle, to grant Dorne its autonomy if they aided him in defending the realm against Daenerys. The Dornish woman, satisfied, promised to send engineers with improved scorpion designs. They would bolster the city's defenses and, if necessary, mount an expedition to bring the fight to the dragon from more than one angle. Tyrion drafted a formal agreement, sealed with the king's signet. Word was sent south by swift riders. And so, behind King's Landing's walls, work began in earnest. Blacksmiths toiled day and night, forging new scorpions. Archers trained to operate them. The designs came from old scrolls, combined with Dornish innovation. They installed these new weapons on the battlements, on strategic rooftops, even hidden within certain alleyways. It was a grim reflection of the last war, but with each improvement, a small flicker of hope ignited. Daenerys, for her part, continued to tighten her hold on the waters and roads leading to the city. More men flocked to her banner, some out of genuine devotion, others for pay or to stand on what they believed was the winning side. She established supply lines from the southern coasts, forging alliances or at least securing neutrality from various minor lords who saw an opportunity to profit. Her fleet ringed the bay. Drogon's roars became a common nighttime terror as he soared over the city, letting the watchers know he was there but not unleashing his flames on the stone walls. Yet, she knew that if she burned the entire city again, the realm might never bend the knee. But the threat was enough to keep many cowering. She wanted them to surrender out of fear, not burn them outright. Then came the day the first stones flew. One of Daenerys's war galleys ventured too close to the mouth of the Blackwater Rush, testing the defenses. The defenders loosed a massive stone from a trebuchet they had installed. With a groan of ropes and wood, the projectile arced high and crashed into the deck of the warship, splintering it. Cheers went up along the walls, though they knew it was a minor victory. The real threat was Drogon, who roared overhead but did not strike. Daenerys did not want to risk her dragon by sending him alone against scorpions. Instead, she bided her time, letting the city's supplies dwindle further. Inside the Red Keep, Jon wrestled with the moral dilemma of launching a surprise attack on Dragonstone. Tyrion counseled caution. Daenerys's defenses there would be formidable, and Drogon could lay waste to any attacking ships in a flash of flame. Moreover, losing more ships would weaken King's Landing's last line of retreat. So they waited, pinned inside their own capital, uncertain how to break the stalemate. Tensions among the small folk reached a fever pitch. Jon tried to organize distribution of meager rations, but there was never enough to quell the hunger. Rumors abounded that Daenerys had promised bread and safety if the city opened its gates. Some believed it, some didn't. Sporadic riots broke out, with men claiming they'd take matters into their own hands. The Gold Cloaks tried to maintain order, but loyalty to Jon was not universal. In certain taverns, conspirators met to discuss whether to open the gates by force or assassinate the king to earn favor with the Dragon Queen. Spies whispered in the corridors of the Red Keep that infiltration might be attempted. The city was a tinderbox, one spark away from exploding. Jon felt the weight of it all crushing him. In quiet moments, he thought of walking away, simply leaving the throne and letting Daenerys take it. But he knew that would not bring peace. The realm would remember her devastation of King's Landing, and rebellion would simmer. The cycle would continue. Moreover, his counsel reminded him that Daenerys might not forgive those who stood against her. A bloodbath of vengeance could follow, and if she truly believed in the Red Priestess's prophecy about a holy mission, who knew what else she might do? So the siege wore on, day after agonizing day, each moment a step closer to a final reckoning. Ravaged by hunger and fear, King's Landing's mood turned sullen. Meanwhile, Daenerys's forces entrenched outside. The realm held its breath. Finally, the storm broke. In the gray dawn of a drizzling day, horns sounded along the city's walls. Daenerys's host was moving en masse, assembling on the plains south of King's Landing. Reports rushed in that her war galleys were advancing closer too, their scorpions at the ready. A land and sea assault seemed imminent. Jon ordered every available soldier to the battlements, every scorpion to be manned, every longbow to be knocked. The city's bells hung silent. No one dared ring them to signal surrender, not with the memory of the last time those bells tolled. The battlefield formed in a sprawl outside the city gates. Daenerys's sellswords, gathered from across the narrow sea, arrayed themselves in disciplined lines. Some carried the banners of the Targaryen sigil, a statement of unity. Others carried the insignias of their sellsword companies: the bright spears, the Titan's claw, the free falcons, and more. In the center of it all stood Daenerys, mounted on a pale horse, wearing armor of black and red. The Red Priestess stood at her side, chanting quietly to R'hllor. The sky overhead was thick with storm clouds. From the city gates, a contingent of King's men emerged. They wore the newly forged armor of the realm, with sigils representing houses that still supported Jon. They formed ranks, commanded by Brienne of Tarth and a few other knights who had pledged loyalty to the king. Archers lined the walls above, scorpions behind them, ready to loose their deadly bolts at Drogon if he appeared. Jon rode out on a black horse, the Stark sigil pinned to his cloak. He never felt right displaying the Targaryen sigil. He halted a distance away, flanked by his guard. Across the wide stretch of muddy ground, he locked eyes with Daenerys one last time. No words were exchanged. She lifted her hand, and Drogon descended from the sky with a thunderous roar, landing heavily behind her. The beast's obsidian scales and glowing eyes made it look like an ancient god of war. Soldiers on both sides quailed at the sight, yet the scorpions on the walls swiveled, aiming carefully. Jon took a deep breath and raised his sword, calling for archers to hold. A hush fell. Daenerys seemed to hesitate, looking at the city that had once been hers. Then her resolve hardened. She spurred her horse forward, and her host advanced with her, the Sellswords marching in tight formation, their weapons bristling. The war drums beat a relentless rhythm. On the walls, horns sounded. The defenders knocked arrows. The tension was unbearable. Then came the roar of Drogon as he launched into the air, flames licking his jaws. The watchers on the battlements released their scorpion bolts, steel-tipped missiles streaking through the stormy sky. Some soared past the dragon, missing wide. Others forced him to bank sharply, a furious shriek echoing across the field. Daenerys's ground forces quickened their pace, ready to breach the gates or engage the defenders in open battle. On the ground, Brienne led the cavalry charge, her white cloak streaming. The two armies clashed in a cacophony of steel and cries, mud flying from under the horses' hooves. Swords met shields with ringing force. Daenerys's Sellswords fought with lethal skill, but the defenders fought with desperation and a sense of duty. Chaos erupted on the field. Drogon circled overhead, belching fire at pockets of defenders. Some scorpions continued to fire, but hitting a moving dragon in the midst of a swirling battle was no easy task. Jon, in the thick of the fray, swung his sword with practiced precision. Memories of the Battle of the Bastards of the Long Night flooded his mind. Once again, he was submerged in the grim dance of death, hearing only the ringing in his ears, seeing only the swirl of bodies and the flash of dragonfire. A direct scorpion bolt finally struck Drogon's flank, though at a glancing angle. The dragon roared in pain, twisting in the sky. His flames engulfed a portion of the city wall, sending masonry and men tumbling. Smoke and screams rose. On the field below, Daenerys pressed forward. She knew that if her ground troops could break the lines and open the gates, the city would fall. She wore an implacable mask of determination. Jon spotted her across the battlefield, a swirl of red and black in the melee. He urged his horse toward her, cutting down a mercenary who blocked his path. Lightning crackled overhead. The stench of burned flesh and damp earth filled his nostrils. If he could just reach her, perhaps end this or force her to stand down. But in the chaos, Sellswords closed around him, forcing him to fight for his life. Amidst the tumult, Tyrion stood on the walls, watching with horror. He ordered the scorpions to concentrate fire on Drogon, but the great beast was cunning, soaring out of range, then swooping down to unleash bursts of flame. The siege towers Daenerys' forces had brought were inching closer. The defenders threw flaming pitch down on them. Screams of burning men rent the air. The storm clouds unleashed a cold rain, but it could not quell the fires burning below. In a desperate move, Daenerys signaled. A second wave of her forces, hidden among the nearby hills, surged forth. This included cavalry she had acquired, light horse from Essos, skilled in swift maneuvers. They struck the flanks of Jon's defenders, sowing chaos. The line wavered. Brienne fought fiercely, but she was surrounded by enemies. Her armor was dented, her sword arm growing weary. Then, a trumpet blast from the north side of the field. Reinforcements arrived, banners bearing the sigil of House Baratheon. Gendry had arrived from the Stormlands with fresh troops. They charged into the fray, slamming into Daenerys' flank. The sudden impact buckled the Sellswords formation. Cheers rose from Jon's side, but Drogon responded with wrathful flames, immolating scores of Gendry's men. The battlefield was a churning mass of gore and fury. Still, the arrival of the Stormlanders gave King Aegon's forces a flicker of hope. Jon rallied his men, slicing through the press of foes until he reached a vantage point. He spotted Daenerys again, dismounted now, fighting on foot with a sword in hand. Her face was smudged with ash, her hair plastered to her skin by rain, but she fought with a feral grace. The Red Priestess stood behind her, chanting, weaving illusions of flame. Some said they saw the shadows flicker around her, shapes that unnerved the bravest men. Jon spurred his horse forward, heading straight for Daenerys. He leapt off mid-stride and rolled, coming to his feet just yards away from her. At once, a ring of mercenaries stepped between them. Jon raised his sword, meeting their steel in a series of desperate parries. Daenerys locked eyes with him over the blades of her protectors, her expression unreadable. Was it rage, hurt, or some twisted combination of both? He dispatched 2 Sellswords with swift, brutal efficiency. The clang of steel resonated in his bones. Another lunged at him. He dodged, slicing the man's leg, then dispatching him. Now there was only a single figure between Jon and Daenerys, the Red Priestess. She looked at Jon with eyes alight, as if in a trance. In her hand, a dagger glimmered. Jon instinctively raised his sword, ready to defend. The priestess whispered something under her breath, some foreign incantation, and lunged. Jon parried, feeling an unnatural force behind her blow. Steel screeched on steel. Daenerys watched, breathing heavily. She could have run him through at that moment, but something in her froze. A memory, perhaps, of the man she had once loved. The battlefield raged around them, but for an instant, time seemed to slow. Jon twisted free of the priestess's assault and swung a hard blow, slicing her hand. She cried out, dropping the dagger, red droplets spattering the wet earth. With a swift kick, Jon knocked her aside. Now he stood face to face with Daenerys, both of them soaked in rain and sweat, surrounded by a vortex of violence. Lightning split the sky. Her silver hair glinted, and his dark curls clung to his brow. The thunder that followed shook the ground. "You don't have to do this," Jon gasped, breath ragged. "Call off your men. We can end it now." She stared at him, tears mixing with the rain on her cheeks. "It's too late," she said. "You left me no choice." A roar from above signaled Drogon's descent. Jon looked up in alarm. The black dragon might unleash flames at any moment, scorching friend and foe alike. Daenerys could call him off, but would she? He braced himself. One scorpion bolt streaked past Drogon, forcing him to will away momentarily, but the threat remained. Daenerys gripped her sword. "If I let you live, the realm will never truly be mine," she whispered. "They'll always see you as the rightful king." Jon felt the weight of the truth. In that moment, he thought perhaps he should yield, let her kill him if that would save the realm from further bloodshed. But would it? Or would it spur his supporters to fight even harder, igniting vengeance? He hesitated. She lunged, steel aimed at his heart. He brought his own sword up, deflecting her blow. The clash of metal reverberated through his arms. They circled each other in the mud, swords slicing the rain-laden air, each seeking an opening. Their footwork was sure, honed by years of battle. The spark of rage and sorrow in their eyes matched the lightning overhead. Jon managed a thrust that sliced across Daenerys' armor, but it did not pierce her flesh. She hissed in pain or frustration. She countered with a slash that Jon barely ducked. Around them, the fighting had momentarily parted, as if the swirl of fate itself gave them space for this final confrontation. Blow after blow, parry after parry, they fought. Neither truly wished to kill the other, yet both knew the realm demanded a resolution. The mud sucked at their boots, the rain drenched their faces. Fire from Drogon glowed in the corner of Jon's vision, lighting up the gloom. He heard the screams of men, the clangor of arms. Each second stretched into an eternity. At last, Jon slipped on the slick ground. Daenerys took advantage, her blade arcing for his neck. He barely got his sword up in time, the force of her blow rattling him to the core. He locked eyes with her as their blades bound, muscles straining. "Dany," he gasped. "Don't!" A sudden roar, close, deafening. Jon felt the searing heat as Drogon's massive head swooped down. His jaws parted, flame licking the edges. Jon braced for the rush of fire, but the scorpions on the walls fired again. One bolt struck Drogon in the shoulder, another grazed his neck. The beast roared in agony, flailing. His massive tail slammed into the ground near where Daenerys stood, sending her sprawling. Jon dived aside, narrowly avoiding being crushed. Chaos ensued. Drogon staggered, writhing in pain. Archers on the walls let loose a flurry of arrows. Sel's-Wards surged forward to protect their queen. Jon tried to rise, but the muddy ground seized his feet. He saw Daenerys struggling to stand, her gaze torn between Drogon's agony and the fray around her. A new volley of scorpion bolts hissed through the air. One lodged deep in Drogon's chest, an impact that caused the dragon to shriek, a sound of pure agony. He spasmed, unleashing a torrent of flames skyward in a final, furious expulsion. Men scattered in terror. Daenerys screamed for her dragon, stumbling toward him. The black beast collapsed onto the churned earth, wings flapping weakly. She reached Drogon's head just as the great creature gave one final ragged breath, black blood oozing from the wounds. The life faded from his huge, fiery eyes. Daenerys' cry was a sound torn from her soul. She pressed her forehead to Drogon's snout, tears mingling with the rain. The unstoppable force, the last living dragon, lay dying at her feet. Around them, the battle stilled, men from both sides gaping at the sight of the fallen dragon. In that moment, no one fought. The storm's rumble filled the silence. Jon approached slowly, sword lowered. Mud caked his armor, blood streaked his face. He felt no triumph, only a cold hollowness in his chest. He could see the heartbreak in Daenerys' posture, the anguish that racked her body. Her dragon, her child in so many ways, was gone, and with him died the dream of House Targaryen's restored might. Daenerys rose unsteadily, turning to face Jon. For a heartbeat, neither spoke. Her cheeks were stained with tears. Her eyes, once burning with the fire of conviction, now looked extinguished. She raised her sword, trembling. "I came here to claim what was mine," she whispered. "They took everything from me. My child, my unsullied, my friends, my throne." Jon felt a surge of pity so profound it nearly undid him. "It was never supposed to be like this," he said hoarsely. "I'm sorry." Her lips parted in a trembling sob. "No, no, you betrayed me." She lifted the sword, as though to strike him, but her arms shook. All around, the battered remains of her host looked on, uncertain. King's Landing's defenders, too, held back, not knowing if the fight was truly over. Jon stepped forward, reaching out. "Daenerys," he said softly, using the gentlest tone he could muster, the tone he once used when they lay together in the cold nights of the north. "It's done. There's no more need for blood." Her sword clattered to the ground. She sank to her knees, tears flowing freely. The savage queen, the breaker of chains, the mother of dragons, reduced to despair. Jon knelt beside her, cautious yet drawn by compassion. He placed a hand on her shoulder. She did not resist. The air smelled of wet ash and copper, the battlefield strewn with bodies, but for an instant, they were alone in their shared grief. The men around them slowly realized the fighting had stopped. The news spread across the field like lightning. Drogon was dead. The queen was undone. Some Sel's-Wards surrendered on the spot. Others fled. A ragged cheer rose from some of King's Landing's defenders, though none felt truly victorious. The cost in lives and heartbreak was too high for jubilation. Jon gently helped Daenerys to her feet. She was shaking. She glanced at Drogon's still form, a whimper escaping her lips. "He was my last child," she whispered. "They are all gone now." Jon could find no words. He thought of Ghost, of Regal and Viserion, of all the lives lost on the long road. The sorrow was crushing. He put an arm around her, guiding her away from the corpse of the dragon. Brienne approached warily, bloodied but alive. The rest of Jon's guard likewise gathered, unsure of what came next. Daenerys, once the unstoppable queen, now looked like a broken woman. She barely registered the presence of others. Her eyes were fixed on some distant point, perhaps her vanished dreams. Jon signaled to the men to take her into custody, but with gentleness. No one dared protest. Sel's still loyal to her, saw the finality in the scene and laid down their arms. The Red Priestess had vanished in the confusion, leaving no trace. Thus ended the second dance of the dragons, a Targaryen civil war of heartbreak and ruin. The realm had been spared another complete burning, but at the cost of countless lives and the last living dragon. The ground outside King's Landing was a graveyard of men, horses, and broken machinery of war. Smoke curled from scattered fires, and the storm clouds slowly dispersed, letting the cold daylight fall upon the battered armies. Jon Snow, King Aegon Targaryen, walked among the wounded, among the dying. He gave what comfort he could, numb with fatigue. Soldiers bowed to him, but he felt only weariness. In time, he returned to the city, bringing Daenerys with him in a quiet procession. The small folk, exhausted and hungry, lined the streets to watch. Some cheered weakly, relieved the siege was over. Others looked upon the fall, and Queen with pity or revulsion. Within the Red Keep, Jon gave the order to confine Daenerys to a comfortable suite, guarded at all hours. There would be no public spectacle, no torment. Tyrion, battered and shaken, stood beside his king, at a loss for words. They both knew the realm would demand justice or vengeance or both. Days passed in a blur. The city resumed the process of scraping by, burying the dead, clearing the debris of battle. Envoys arrived from across the realm to learn the outcome. Gendry Baratheon returned to the Stormlands to manage the aftermath there. Sansa Stark wrote from Winterfell, expressing relief that the war was ended, though a note of sadness bled through her words at the cost. Meanwhile, Daenerys remained locked in her room, speaking to no one except perhaps herself. When Jon visited, she would stare at him with red-rimmed eyes, not speaking, or if she did, it was to murmur about dragons or the throne she had lost. He tried to reach her, to offer some solace, but her spirit seemed shattered. It pained him more than he dared admit, remembering the passion that once burned within her. The realm clamored for a trial or an execution. Lord Royce from the Vale insisted that she be tried for her crimes. Several river lords demanded her head. Others said she should be locked away for life, or sent to the Night's Watch if the watch still had any meaning. Jon listened to them all, soul-weary, uncertain what was right. He had exiled her once, and it led to this. Now, the realm demanded something more definitive. At last, a great assembly was called in the Red Keep. Lords and ladies from far and wide traveled to attend or sent representatives. Jon sat on the modest throne, draped in black, facing the throng. Daenerys stood before them, bound at the wrists, though not in chains. She was silent, her eyes downcast. The hush in the hall was complete. Jon spoke, his voice echoing. Daenerys Targaryen committed grave acts against the realm. She burned King's Landing, leading to the deaths of many innocent people. She returned to wage war, claiming the throne by right of blood, costing countless more lives. The realm demands justice. He paused, looking at her with pain in his eyes. She did not look up. Yet she also fought against the dead in the north. She freed thousands from slavery across the narrow sea. She sacrificed much in the name of what she believed was right. The realm's memory of these deeds wore with the destruction she wrought. A murmur rose from the onlookers, uncertain. Jon quieted them with a raised hand. I cannot in good conscience execute her. That would be an act of vengeance, not justice. Nor can I banish her once more, lest we repeat this cycle of death. He took a shaky breath. I have decided that Daenerys Targaryen shall spend her remaining days in seclusion, far from the realm's throne. She will be placed under guard, but treated with dignity. She will no longer be called a queen, no longer hold any titles in Westeros. Thus we end this war, and thus we spare the realm further bloodshed. Outrage erupted among some lords. Others looked relieved. A clamor of voices filled the hall, but Jon's face was set, the finality of his words clear. Tyrion stepped forward to disperse the crowd, calling for calm. The king's word was law, and no lord could truly oppose him without risking a new conflict that no one wanted. Reluctantly, they accepted. Daenerys was led away, her expression vacant. Rumors spread that she would be confined in a remote keep near the Westerlands, guarded by a detachment loyal to the crown, where she could live out her days quietly, no longer a threat. Some whispered she might waste away from sorrow. Others whispered she might find a way to escape and rise again. But for now, the realm was spared another war. Thus, the Targaryen civil war that began with Jon Snow's banishment of Daenerys ended in a shattered peace. The last dragon lay dead upon the fields outside the city, a monument to the ruinous path of vengeance and ambition. The realm began to heal, slowly, though scars would remain for generations. The streets of King's Landing resounded not with cheers but with a weary silence, haunted by memories of flame and blood. Jon Snow, King Aegon Targaryen, carried the guilt and grief of this conflict for the rest of his days. He ruled as justly as he could, haunted by the love he'd lost and the war it spawned. In time, songs would be written of the tragic dance of these two Targaryens, of the sorrow that befell them both. Yet for the people of Westeros, life continued, seasons turned, and the realm found a cautious stability under the king they never asked for but learned to respect. In a quiet keep surrounded by rolling hills and whispering winds, Daenerys Targaryen sat by a window overlooking the sunset. Her silver hair had grown long again, braided simply. Every so often, she would murmur a name: Drogon, Yora, Missandei, or Jon. She would gaze at the sky as though expecting the shape of a dragon to appear. The world outside moved on, but she remained, a relic of a dream that burned too bright and too fiercely for Westeros to bear. No grand celebrations marked the war's end. No feasts of victory. The realm simply exhaled, glad the dragon's shadow was gone at last. And in that subdued conclusion, there lay the true legacy of the conflict. A sorrowful reminder that fire and blood, unchecked, could only bring heartbreak, even when wielded by one who had once promised salvation. The passing of days did little to ease the collective mourning that draped itself over the Seven Kingdoms. The city that had once been the glorious hub of royal power was a battered shell of its former self, haunted by memories of two cataclysmic battles under Dragonfire and the relentless churn of war. King Aegon, Jon Snow to many, moved through the Red Keep with a solemnity that reflected the realm's wounded state. The once bustling corridors were thinner of people, fewer courtiers wandering in their finery, fewer guards laughing or gossiping at their posts. The hush was a testament to the near-constant funerals being held in the city's ashes. He had no illusions about his popularity. Though he wore the crown, he did so with the same reluctant air as when he had first accepted the title. In the weeks after Daenerys Targaryen's defeat and subsequent confinement, there came both praise and condemnation. Some lords hailed him as a savior who had ended the destructive cycle of dragon rule. Others whispered that he had orchestrated a callous betrayal, that he was no better than the usurpers who had once stolen the throne from House Targaryen generations ago. The murmurs varied in tone and pitch, and none of them gave Jon any peace. He found himself avoiding the Iron Throne's remains whenever possible. The seat that Daenerys had half melted in her wrath remained a grotesque monument, and though a new, simpler throne had been fashioned for the king, it carried the same aura of burden. The Red Keep was riddled with memories of war. Sometimes, in the evenings, he would retreat to Maegor's Holdfast or even down to the quieter gardens where the flicker of torches and the scent of crushed flowers might grant a moment's respite. During these solitary walks, his thoughts inevitably wandered to her. Daenerys. She existed in a strange twilight of memory and presence. He had confined her under guard in a keep near the Golden Tooth, a fortress that technically belonged to the crown but was far from the teeming heart of the capital. Few traveled there without explicit permission from the king, and the fortress itself was remote enough that no simple means of escape existed. He had made sure the garrison there was loyal, commanded by a knight whose family had once fought under Ned Stark in the Greyjoy Rebellion, a man who had sworn to keep watch without cruelty. Jon did not wish for her to be treated as a common prisoner of war. He wanted her safe if not free. In the first week, rumors circulated that Daenerys had tried to starve herself, or that she wept every night until her voice gave out. Some said she had tried to call upon the Red Priestess who had vanished in the chaos of the final battle, seeking some dark miracle. Others insisted she was simply broken, drifting aimlessly within the fortress walls, unresponsive to visitors. Jon received one tightly worded report from the knight in command, who stated only that the former queen was alive and physically unharmed, but her disposition was gravely sorrowful. Jon found no relief in that. He hardly slept. Tyrion Lannister fared little better. Though he remained Hand of the King, he looked more gaunt than ever, his eyes shadowed with the twin burdens of guilt and the endless demands of rebuilding. King's Landing's reconstruction staggered on. The entire city smelled of freshly hewn wood and mortar as new timbers were hauled in to rebuild structures destroyed by dragonfire. Beggars thronged the streets, refugees from the war. The crown's treasury had been depleted many times over, so Davos, as master of ships, had turned part of his attention to commerce, forging new trade deals with Bravos and Pentos in a bid to keep coin flowing. Meanwhile, the city braced for fresh storms. The war had not ended neatly with Daenerys' defeat. Across the realm, smaller conflicts still simmered like dying embers, ready to flare up at the slightest gust of rumor or ambition. Loyalties had been tested beyond endurance. On the Reach's borders, rival claimants still argued over who should hold Highgarden, since no Tyrell survived. In the Iron Islands, Yara Greyjoy found her authority contested by a scattering of Reavers who questioned any alliance with a Targaryen king, especially one rumored to be half Stark. Dorne's newly won autonomy cast a long shadow. After the final battle, Jon had no choice but to confirm the arrangement he made with the Dornish envoy. Dorne was effectively independent, though how precisely that independence was defined, tribute, trade, or fealty, remained nebulous. Lady Nemella Corgyle wrote from Sunspear, demanding that the king sign an official decree solidifying the region's freedom from the Iron Throne. Tyrion advised caution, but Jon knew a promise was a promise. If he withheld it, all the alliances he'd forged in desperation might unravel. Though the roads were safer now that no war host roamed near King's Landing, the common people still faced roving bands of outlaws, mercenaries turned brigands, or simply men too hungry to care about the laws of men. The gold cloaks were stretched thin trying to enforce order in the capital itself, and no one had the manpower for thorough patrols of the countryside. Late one evening, a raven arrived from Winterfell. Maester Wolkan had penned the letter under Lady Sansa Stark's direction. It brought more troubles. Apparently, a minor house in the far north, House Slate, had decided it no longer recognized the authority of the crown, citing the realm's fractures and the North's heavy losses in the wars. They had declared themselves loyal only to Lady Stark. Sansa had responded by urging calm and summoning them to Winterfell for talks, but House Slate refused, fortifying their small castle. A handful of other houses, mainly those decimated by the war, seemed to be following suit, flirting with the idea of an independent North again. Sansa's letter expressed a plea for the king's guidance, but it also hinted at her frustration. She did not want another war in the North, not after everything that had happened. Yet the seeds of rebellion were sown, and if left unchecked, it could spread. Jon read the missive with a sour taste in his mouth. The realm was once again fracturing, even if more subtly this time. The great foe that was Daenerys Targaryen's might had been defeated, but that only opened the door to smaller foes, each with their own agendas. With the Targaryen threat neutralized, the lords of Westeros were free to squabble over old grievances. Blood feuds, land disputes, unresolved vendettas. It all threatened to bubble up. He placed the letter aside and stared at the flickering candle on his desk. He tried to recall why he had fought so hard, for the living, to protect the people from the army of the dead, from Cersei's tyranny, from the flames of Drogon. Had it been worth it, if all that remained was a realm pieced together by frayed threads, threatened by petty fiefdoms and ambition? His shoulders sagged under the weight of an unrelenting burden. The next morning, Tyrion arrived in the council chamber to find the king already seated, a cup of watered wine untouched at his elbow. Jon indicated the seat across from him, and Tyrion took it, eyeing the stack of Raven's messages that threatened to topple over. The tension in the air was palpable. More letters from the north? Tyrion asked, voice subdued. Jon nodded. House Slate, he said, pushing the letter across the table. They're refusing Sansa's summons, basically claiming independence from both Winterfell and the Iron Throne. They won't accept my authority. Sansa's uncertain how to force compliance without a fight. Tyrion's lips thinned. The last thing we need is an internal conflict in the north. Your sister can't be pleased. She's not. Neither am I. Tyrion ran a hand over his unshaven jaw. Options. Jon exhaled. I could send a royal decree demanding their loyalty, but that might provoke them. Or I could travel north personally, but I can't leave King's Landing right now, not with everything so unstable here. If they keep pressing, the north might devolve into a small-scale war, especially if other discontented lords band together. Tyrion frowned, his eyes darting to the other letters. Any chance we can appease them? They might resent being conscripted in every war or feel shortchanged by the crown's focus on the south. Perhaps we can negotiate an exemption from certain taxes or levies. Sansa offered them such concessions. They refused. It's more about pride than coin. They claim the North spilled too much blood under a Targaryen king's wars. Tyrion gave a humorless chuckle. The North is proud indeed. Well, we can't let them openly flout the crown's authority. That sets a precedent. But if we go in with swords, we risk them appealing to other northern lords who might be swayed. Sansa must handle this carefully. Perhaps if she goes in person and uses her diplomatic skills, they'll come around. Jon nodded thoughtfully. I'll send word to her advising caution. Perhaps if I reaffirm the North's unique status or something of the sort. We're already letting Dorne slip away. I'd rather not break the realm further. Tyrion raised his eyebrows. Speaking of Dorne, we can't delay Lady Corgyle much longer. She's sent repeated messages insisting you formalize their autonomy. If we fail to keep our promise, we risk losing the goodwill that helped us end Daenerys' siege. Jon's gaze flicked to the sealed scroll from Sunspear. Aye, it's all or nothing. The pact we made was the reason we could bring down Drogon. We can't renege. The small council will balk, but I have no choice. Better we do it sooner rather than later, Tyrion said softly, shifting in his seat. The realm is like a cracked vase. Every time we hesitate or give the impression of weakness, more fractures appear. Jon grimaced. Then let's sign the documents and be done with it. They moved on to other matters, though everything felt overshadowed by the sense of a realm struggling to knit itself back together while forces of chaos threatened from all sides. The small council, consisting of Davos, Brienne, now Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, Samwell Tarly, Grand Maester, and Gendry Baratheon, summoned from the Stormlands to represent the crown's war aims, though war was supposedly ended, assembled shortly after. As expected, the news about Dorne's autonomy triggered some protests. Gendry bristled at the notion. Davos quietly accepted it as inevitable. Brienne looked concerned but deferred to Jon's judgment. Sam tried to argue for a measured approach, pointing out the historical ties between Dorne and the rest of the realm, but in the end, all recognized that the king had already made a vow. By midday, the decree was written. Dorne would become an autonomous principality, acknowledging the king in name but paying no taxes or fealty. Tyrion insisted on a face-saving clause that if Dorne engaged in warfare outside its own borders, the crown could reconsider the arrangement. Lady Nemella Corgyle would likely seize the chance to press for even more liberties, but at least it was a starting point. The official seal was pressed, wax cooling under the Targaryen sigil, a symbol that carried more irony than pride. The next weeks bled into months, a slow and painful time of reorganization. While the realm was not at war, it was certainly not at peace. Jon tried to maintain a semblance of stability by holding audiences with various lords, listening to petitions regarding land disputes, hearing countless stories of woe from families torn apart by the war. He authorized funds for rebuilding certain key roads, hoping to facilitate trade and unity. Taverns and brothels in King's Landing filled with men seeking to forget their troubles. Thieves flourished in the chaos, and the cost of bread rose so high that small folk cursed the crown for failing to address rampant inflation. Tyrion scrambled to fix it, but supply and demand bent to no man's will easily. Through it all, Daenerys's name continued to evoke strong passions. Some whispered she had once been their liberator and might be again. Others spat at the mere mention of her, cursing her for the burning of King's Landing. The city's memory of Dragonfire was not easily erased, and yet a certain twisted nostalgia formed among those who claimed the realm was strong under Targaryen rule in the old days. These whispers reached Jon's ears too. He tried to dismiss them, though they always left him with a sick feeling in his gut. He did not visit Daenerys for a long while. Each time he considered it, he recalled the last image he had of her. Kneeling beside Drogon's corpse, heartbroken and inconsolable. He feared seeing her again, feared the torrent of guilt and sorrow that would crash over him. A selfish reluctance, perhaps, but one that weighed heavily on him. A man who had once loved a woman enough to call her his queen, who had once tried to stand at her side against the dead, now sat on the throne she had tried to claim. The irony clawed at him daily. It was nearly 6 months after her defeat when the first rumor of Daenerys's ill health arrived at the Red Keep. One of the knights stationed at the remote fortress wrote that she had fallen into a deep melancholy, refusing to eat or speak at length with anyone, rising from her bed only to stare out over the battlements. Winter snows dusted those hills earlier than expected, and the stone walls offered a chilly atmosphere even on the best of days. The knight said she coughed often and seemed feverish at times. Jon frowned over the letter. The words were laced with a polite warning. "We are doing our best, Your Grace, but she is unresponsive. Should we call for a maester?" Jon immediately summoned Samwell Tarly, who prepared to travel north and tend to her if necessary. But Sam was also needed in King's Landing. There was an outbreak of fever in Flea Bottom that threatened to become an epidemic. Torn between duties, Sam delegated another maester from the Citadel, a younger man named Maester Ethan, to make the journey. Jon sent a reply urging the knight to do everything possible to keep Daenerys comfortable and that more help was on the way. But the letter gnawed at him. Guilt churned in his stomach. He found himself pacing the ramparts of the Red Keep at night, gazing at the star-filled sky, wondering if he should go in person. Tyrion urged caution. "Your presence might inflame the situation," Tyrion said. She could see it as a sign of weakness, or it might stir up her old supporters. "Let the maester handle it. You've done what you can." Jon appreciated Tyrion's concern, but something within him rebelled at the idea of leaving her to suffer alone in some distant keep. She might still hate him, but he felt responsible not just as king but as the man who had loved her. Finally, one cold morning, he mounted his horse and rode out with a small retinue of guards. He did not announce his departure broadly, telling only Tyrion, Brienne, and Davos. He left the day-to-day governance in the hands of his hand, trusting that Tyrion could manage for a short while. He had to see her, whether it was wise or not. He could not bear the thought of her wasting away without a final conversation, or at least some measure of kindness. The journey took several days. The roads were muddy from recent rains, and autumn's chill had begun to creep south. Jon and his retinue avoided large towns, not wanting to draw too much attention. As they traveled, he saw the scars of war everywhere. Burnt farmsteads, half-collapsed inns, villages where orphans begged for scraps. He gave what he could in coin and comfort, but no single king could mend so many wounds in one lifetime. The oppression of it all weighed on him like an invisible chain, tugging at each step of his horse's hooves. When they reached the fortress near the Golden Tooth, Jon was greeted by the knight in command, a tall, wiry man named Ser Roderick Kane. Ser Roderick bowed deeply, showing respect, but his eyes flickered with a mixture of relief and trepidation. The presence of the king here was unexpected and not easily kept secret. Nevertheless, he led Jon's retinue inside, ordering the gates closed behind them. The fortress was a squat, square structure of thick stone walls perched amid rolling hills that gradually rose into mountains further west. The wind howled through narrow passes, bringing hints of early snow. Guards patrolled the battlements in heavy cloaks, stamping their feet to keep warm. Jon dismounted and followed Ser Roderick into the main hall, which was sparsely furnished, though a fire crackled in the hearth. The floors were strewn with rushes, replaced weekly to combat the cold. A handful of men sat at a trestle table, quietly eating stew. They stood at once upon seeing the king, bowing or saluting as best they could. "My lord," Ser Roderick said, guiding Jon to a private antechamber. "I didn't expect you to come, but we are honored to receive you. We've done our best with the prisoner." Jon cut him off gently. "She's not just a prisoner. How is she?" Ser Roderick looked slightly uncomfortable. Well, she doesn't speak much. She refuses to leave her room most days. She'll stand by the window for hours, staring at nothing. Sometimes she weeps or prays. I can't tell. She's ill, I think, though Maester Ethan arrived a fortnight ago and says it's more exhaustion and grief than any physical malady. Cough, yes, but not severe. She's been eating a little more since the Maester came. Jon's chest tightened. "Have you treated her kindly?" The knight nodded. "We keep her warm. We let her walk the battlements if she wishes, though she rarely does. She's under guard, but no cruelty has been done." "I know who she was, sire, but she's not a threat here." "Thank you," Jon said quietly. "I'd like to see her." Ser Roderick led him up a winding staircase to a corridor at the keep's upper level. 2 guards stood at attention outside a thick wooden door. A single arrow slit in the corridor let in cold, gray light. The wind rattled the shutters. Ser Roderick signaled the guards, who unbolted the door. Jon asked to enter alone, and after a moment's hesitation, the knight and guards stepped back. Jon swallowed, then walked inside. The room was small, the walls made of coarse stone. A single fireplace emitted a dim glow, but no tapestries or decorations brightened the space. A narrow bed was pushed against the far wall, its blankets tangled. A table held some leftover bread and a pitcher of water. By the window stood Daenerys Targaryen, her silver hair longer than Jon remembered, loose around her shoulders. She wore a simple gown of gray wool, far removed from the regal black and red she had once donned. He could see the faint lines under her eyes, the pallor of her cheeks. He shut the door softly behind him. For a moment, he simply watched her, unsure of what to say. She had heard him enter but did not turn around. Her gaze remained fixed outside, where a patch of leaden sky pressed against the horizon. Finally, Jon cleared his throat softly. "Dany," he murmured. Her shoulders stiffened at the sound of his voice, a tremor passing through her frame. She took a moment before she turned, the ghost of her once radiant presence still visible in the angles of her face. Those violet eyes that had once burned with fierce ambition and longing now looked dull, as if the fire had been extinguished. She studied him for a beat, not speaking, then turned away and returned her stare to the window. Jon stepped closer. I heard you were unwell." She let out a soft, mirthless laugh. "Unwell?" she repeated, voice flat. "Is that what they tell you?" He moved cautiously toward her, each step feeling like crossing a cavern. "I came to see if there's anything that can be done, if you need help or better conditions." She laughed again, the sound brittle. "Help?" she said quietly. "You made sure there was no help left for me, Jon Snow." The last 2 words carried an undercurrent of old bitterness, subdued by apathy. "This room is better than a dungeon cell. Yet it is a cell all the same, no matter how the walls are dressed." He found no immediate reply. She was right, in a way. "I'm sorry," he said. "I never wanted this." She shrugged one shoulder. "But you wanted to save the realm from me, and you did. It saved." She lifted her eyes to him, and for the first time he saw a flicker of that old storm inside her. "Are they grateful, Jon? Do they sing your praises? Or do they whisper about your betrayal? Your Targaryen blood? Your stolen throne?" He winced at the accusation in her tone. "They whisper many things. I never wanted the throne. You know that." "Yes," she said, her lips twisting slightly. "I knew it then and I know it now. Strange how you wear the crown anyway." She looked away, exhaling a tremulous breath. "Why are you here? Did you come to see me broken? To ease your conscience?" "No," he whispered. "I came because I care. Because once we mattered to each other. She said nothing, only turned her face back to the window. Outside, snow was falling in light flakes, swirling in the cold wind. He could see her reflection in the glass. Sorrow etched into every line of her face, the proud queen's posture that still refused to slump completely, though she was battered by grief. "I heard you were ill," he repeated. "I wanted to ensure you had the care you need. Whatever you want, I can arrange it. Books, better food, more comfortable accommodations." The corner of her mouth curved in a weary sneer. "Am I to be your pampered prisoner, then? Spoiled and safe, rotting away in a gilded cage?" Her voice cracked, and she shook her head. "Nothing can ease this, John. You took everything from me. My city, my throne, my child." Her voice broke on that last word, recalling Drogon and, in a more distant sense, the children she had never been able to bear. She squeezed her eyes shut. "There's nothing left in me to heal." He reached out tentatively, as though to place a hand on her arm, but she drew away. His hand fell back to his side. "I know I can't undo what happened," he said, "but we're both still here. Let me at least make sure you're not suffering. Please." She was quiet for a long moment, the snowfall outside seeming louder than the space between them. "I don't want pity," she whispered. I don't know anymore what I want. Everything I fought for is gone. I wake up in the morning and remember that my dragons are dead. My army's gone. My throne lost. The people who loved me turned to ash or fled." She swallowed thickly. "The world is emptier than I ever imagined." John's throat felt tight. He thought of all the times he had seen that spark of hope in her eyes, all the times she had believed she was destined for something grand. "I'm so sorry," he repeated, the words feeling pitifully inadequate. She let out a ragged exhale, turning to face him fully. Her eyes flicked over his face, as though searching for something. Whatever she sought, she did not seem to find it. "Will you lock me away here for the rest of my life?" she asked softly. "Is that the plan for the once queen of the Undulls, the Rhoynar, and the First Men?" He hesitated, not wanting to lie. "The realm demanded your death. I couldn't, so this is how we keep the peace. It's the only way to prevent another war." Her laugh was hollow. "Peace. We called it many things once. You said it was always the people that mattered, that you wanted to protect them from the dead. And then from me. Now here we are, in your new world." She turned away again, pressing a hand against the cold stone of the windowsill. "Does it feel like peace to you?" His silence spoke volumes. After a moment, he said, "The realm is fractured, but no open war at the moment. Houses squabble. There's hunger, rebuilding, trade disputes. But at least there's no dragons burning cities." She closed her eyes. "Fire and blood. I suppose that's all they'll remember of me." John stepped closer, speaking gently. "You did more than that, Dany. You freed thousands in Essos. You fought against the White Walkers. People remember that too." She gave a small shake of her head, tears threatening. "Not here. Not now. I'm a cautionary tale, a monster to scare children. The mad queen of a new age, undone by betrayal." Her voice quavered. "I wonder if that's how my father felt in his final days, though he brought it upon himself more than I did. He wished he had better words, some comfort that might reach her." "I know you're angry," he said softly, "and hurt beyond anything I can comprehend. If there was a way to go back." She stopped him with a sharp glance over her shoulder. "Don't speak of going back. There's no going back for us." Another hush filled the chamber, broken only by the crackling of the fireplace. Finally, she released a shuddering breath. "You offered me better conditions. I'll take what little dignity I can keep. Bring me books, yes, so I can lose myself in stories if nothing else. Let me walk outside the keep sometimes, supervised if you must, but not always walled in. I promise you, I have no desire to start another war. I can't." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "I can't." He nodded, relief and sorrow mingling. "You have my word. I'll speak to Ser Roderick. Whatever you need." She turned to face him once more. For a moment, something almost like gratitude flickered in her eyes, quickly overshadowed by weary resignation. "Then leave me now," she said. "I can't bear more of this conversation." Jon bowed his head, a gesture that felt foreign, yet he wanted to show her respect. "I'll arrange those things. I hope you find some measure of peace." She said nothing, watching him with a guarded expression until he stepped out and closed the door behind him. The latch clicked, and her solitude returned, a tangible weight in the small chamber. Jon stood in the corridor, his hands trembling. The guards lowered their gazes, uncertain what to do or say. He composed himself and quietly asked for Ser Roderick. The night arrived, and Jon relayed Daenerys' requests. The knight agreed at once, relieved to see any sign of her cooperating. As they walked back down the steps, Jon added that a small library or chest of scrolls might be fetched from King's Landing, along with warmer clothing and some comforts. Ser Roderick nodded, scribbling notes on a scrap of parchment. Jon could sense the man's relief that the king seemed more forgiving than the rumor mill suggested. Jon lingered at the fortress for 2 days, ensuring that Daenerys' new accommodations were arranged. He did not see her again, though he asked Maester Ethan about her health. The Maester said she was frail, but not dying. Her malady was half spiritual, half physical, the result of heartbreak, regret, and loss. He predicted she would improve now that her conditions were less grim, provided she found the will to keep living. On the second night, Jon stood on the battlements, gazing at the moonlit hills. Memories chased each other through his mind. The nights he spent in her tent before the battle against the dead, her laughter in moments of rare joy, the day she rode Drogon above the Winterfell skyline. That life felt like a story told about someone else. He wondered if he should speak to her again, try to ease her misery further, but he feared his presence only reopened wounds. When dawn came, he and his retinue departed, heading back toward King's Landing. The journey back was subdued. He felt the pull of returning to the seat of power and the 1,000 responsibilities awaiting him. Part of him wanted to vanish into the wilderness, as he had once considered after the final defeat of the Night King. Duty pulled him back nonetheless, an unbreakable tether. In his absence, Tyrion had continued to wrestle with the tensions of the realm. Upon Jon's return, the Hand greeted him with a harried sigh. "Your Grace, I trust your trip was helpful?" Jon answered vaguely, "She's alive. She'll manage. That's all I can say." Tyrion accepted that, seeing the turmoil on Jon's face. Then he ushered the king into the council chamber, where Davos, Gendry, and Brienne stood around a table piled high with missives. Sam was absent, busy treating the spreading fever in Flea Bottom. Tyrion pointed to a new letter from Winterfell. "We have developments in the north," he said grimly. Jon read Sansa's letter with a deepening frown. House Slate had been joined by 2 other minor houses, House Tallheart and House Overton, in an alliance that declared formal secession from Winterfell's rule. They had gathered a small force, barricading themselves near an old fortress in the northern hills. Sansa was unwilling to commit a large-scale assault, fearing it would ignite a greater conflict and force other houses to choose sides. She begged Jon for a solution that did not involve butchering her own people. Davos shook his head. "We can't have them splitting away. The North is crucial to the stability of the realm. If we let them secede, others might follow." Gendry grunted in agreement. "We're already losing Dorne. This is madness. Are these northern lords so blind to the danger?" Brienne cleared her throat softly. "They fought in every war, the War of the 5 Kings, the war against the dead, the final siege against Daenerys. Their losses were grievous, and they might feel the crown has abandoned them after all they've sacrificed." Tyrion interjected. "I propose we send an envoy with the king's blessing to negotiate. Offer them some form of local autonomy, a guarantee that they'll not be conscripted again soon, but keep them under Sansa's leadership. We must tread carefully. Bloodshed among northerners will only deepen their resentment." Jon rubbed his temple, the beginnings of a headache pulsing. "Who do we send?" "We need someone they'll trust, someone they respect." Brienne lifted her chin. I know Lady Sansa well. If she's already tried and failed to persuade them, maybe we need another Stark presence. Someone with strong ties to the north. But you are not free to travel there yourself, and Arya is gone exploring the Sunset Sea. Jon sighed. His sister Arya had departed shortly after the wars, sailing west with a few companions. She had kept her promise not to return to a life of quiet domesticity. No help from her. Bran was in the far north, rumored to be building a new seat near the old Night Fort, steeped in mystical projects. That left the rest of them. Davos spoke up. Perhaps we can send Tormund Giantsbane if we can reach him. The free folk followed him back beyond the wall, but some remain in the gift. They respect him. Or we can rely on Lady Alyce Karstark, who's sworn to the Starks. But none of this guarantees House Slate will listen. Jon pressed his lips together. We have to try. A compromise, an agreement of partial independence but formal fealty to Winterfell. Some arrangement that keeps the realm from fracturing further. He gazed at Tyrion. Draft the letters. Summon Lady Alyce Karstark if possible. I'll put my seal on whatever compromise might placate them. Tyrion nodded. We'll do our best. But be prepared, Your Grace. If they remain obstinate, Sansa might need to quell them by force. Jon's eyes flickered with sadness. I know, but I'll only sanction that if there's no other option. Thus began a new period of delicate negotiations. Ravens flew back and forth between Winterfell, Carhold, and the rebellious houses in the north. Lady Alyce Karstark took up the mantle of diplomat, traveling under a banner of peace to speak with House Slate. Tormund, who had been near the wall, eventually found his way south to advise the northern lords, cautioning them that any talk of open conflict was foolish after surviving the dead and dragons. Sansa wrote frequent updates, detailing the slow progress. By all accounts, House Slate's demands were simple. No more southern entanglements, a reduced tax burden, and recognition of the North's right to secede from the crown at any future point if they so chose. Jon found that last point deeply troubling. Letting the North hold a formal right to secede could unravel the entire concept of the Seven Kingdoms. But if he refused, he risked turning them into permanent enemies. He wrestled with the question daily, conferring with Tyrion, Davos, and Sam, when the Maester had a spare moment away from his duties. The consensus was that granting such a right would open the floodgates for more secessionist movements, especially in the Reach or the Riverlands, where many still grieved lost kin from the war. Yet forcibly denying it would only stoke more resentment. After weeks of stalemate, Jon penned a personal letter to Sansa. My dear sister, I understand the precarious situation you face. We have all sacrificed too much to let more blood be spilled. I implore you to find a compromise that ensures the North remains part of the realm while addressing their grievances. Grant them significant autonomy in local governance. Promise no further conscriptions without the North's consent, and reduce certain taxes for a period of years to aid their recovery. But please, do not cede the formal right to secede. That is a step too far, one that could destroy everything we've tried to hold together. Trust your judgment, and know that I stand with you. May the old gods guide you. Jon he sealed it and prayed she would find a path forward. Meanwhile, the realm's internal tensions continued to mount in other quarters. Gendry wrote to Storm's End, checking in on the local houses. They remained relatively loyal, though pockets of banditry plagued the wooded areas near the King's Road. The Vale was quiet for now, governed by Lord Royce in Robin Arryn's name, though rumors circulated that the Boyturn man was sickly. If he died, who would succeed him? Another potential crisis. The Riverlands were rife with petty disputes. Edmure Tully, newly reinstated as Lord of Riverrun, tried his best to keep the peace, but countless grudges had emerged from the war. Tyrion spent many hours sending envoys back and forth, urging cooperation. One day, as the first snows dusted the Crownlands, a visitor arrived at the Red Keep, seeking audience with the king. She was a woman in a long red robe, her head shaved bald except for a single strip of black hair. The guards recognized her as a Red Priestess, though not the same one who had served Daenerys. She introduced herself as Khuru, a priestess from the Temple of Volantis, and claimed she bore an urgent message. Tyrion, suspicious of any new Red Priestess, had her kept under guard until Jon could decide whether to see her. Jon, upon learning of the priestess, felt a chill. Memories of that mysterious Red Priestess who had accompanied Daenerys in her final campaign pricked at him. He ordered Khurru brought to the throne room. The hall was not crowded. Jon had taken to hearing petitions in smaller sessions to avoid spectacle. Still, a handful of knights and advisors were present. Khurru entered, bowing low, her robe swishing about her ankles. Her voice was accented, low and melodic. "Your Grace, I come bearing tidings from the Temple of R'hllor in Volantis. Though the Dragon Queen has fallen from power, the Great Fire still watches over this realm. We have had visions that a darkness gathers again, across the sea, in the lands of Sithorios. We cannot interpret all of it, but we believe it may threaten these shores in time." Jon felt an old weariness settle on him. Another prophecy of doom, another lurking threat. He had seen enough of darkness to last several lifetimes. "Why come to me?" he asked, eyes narrowing. "I have no interest in more wars across the ocean." Khurru lowered her gaze respectfully. "The temple knows of your role in the Long Night's End, how you fought the Great Other's forces. They believe you are marked by destiny, though your path is uncertain. They beseech you to heed our warnings. We do not ask for war, but for vigilance. The waves of darkness can come from many directions." Tyrion, standing nearby, snorted softly. "We have had our fill of prophecy, priestess. R'hllor's followers once supported Daenerys Targaryen wholeheartedly. That ended in tragedy. Why should we trust you now?" Khurru's expression did not flicker. "Prophecy is never simple, my lord. We see glimpses, not certainties. The Dragon Queen played her part in ending the threat of the dead, but her path diverged. The Lord of Light does not create one single champion. Sometimes there are many who share the burden. I only come to counsel vigilance. If you choose not to heed this warning, so be it." Jon looked at her for a long moment. He had no love for the Red Priests or their cryptic messages. Yet he knew better than most that unseen horrors could indeed arise. Still, Sithorios was a distant land, rumored to be full of jungles, plagues, and monstrous creatures. "I'll keep your warning in mind," he finally said. "For now, my focus is on healing this realm. If your temple truly wishes to help, you can start by providing relief and medicine for the small folk suffering the winter." Khurru bowed again. "I shall relay your words. Some in our temple do indeed wish to aid the poor. We have done so before. Yet be wary, your grace. Darkness rarely waits for men to be ready." Jon dismissed her. She left with a final bow, a swirl of red cloth on the cold marble floor. Tyrion huffed out a breath. Another prophecy, another shadow on the horizon. I had hoped we could have a few years of peace before the next doomsayer arrived. Jon shook his head. "We'll not march on Sithorios for a rumor. We have enough troubles. But let's keep an ear out for more talk. If this is a real threat, perhaps it will reveal itself in time." The days wore on into the heart of winter. King's Landing was rarely blanketed in snow, but a thin dusting settled on rooftops and melted in the city streets, turning them to slush. People bundled themselves in heavier cloaks, complaining that supplies of firewood were short. Jon authorized the crown storehouses to distribute extra wood and grain where possible, but it was never enough to truly satisfy a city that large. Tyrion juggled funds, raising loans from Braavosi bankers, forging uneasy deals that would tie the realm to foreign creditors for years to come. It was that or watch the city starve. Letters arrived from Dorne, where Lady Nemella Corgyle, newly styled as the Princess of Dorne, held her own court in Sunspear. She wrote with an almost mocking cordiality, boasting of the mild Dornish weather and fruitful harvests, while reminding the king that Dorne no longer owed taxes to the Iron Throne. She also hinted at alliances with the free cities to bolster her trade. Tyrion read her letters with an exasperated grin. She's enjoying this, basking in her new status as an independent ruler. We'll see how long that novelty lasts when she has to quell her own rebellious bannermen. But no threat emerged from Dorne beyond the occasional rumor that a minor Dornish house might harbor resentment for the new regime in Sunspear. Jon had bigger problems to occupy him. In the north, a glimmer of hope arrived. Sansa's negotiation efforts yielded fruit. House Slate and its allies agreed to drop their talk of formal secession if the crown would recognize their right to internal governance without interference, reduce their taxes, and pledge not to draw them into any southern wars for the next decade. Jon breathed a sigh of relief upon reading Sansa's triumphant letter. It was a compromise that fell short of giving the North the right to secede at will. She had secured the realm's unity once more, albeit by a thread. With that crisis averted, the winter months were a slog of administration, slow rebuilding, and the ever-present question of whether Daenerys Targaryen's name would spark further upheavals. The rumor that she still lived in a keep near the Golden Tooth reached various ears. A few foolish men even attempted to stage rescue missions, but Ser Roderick's garrison turned them away easily. One such group of Sellswords claimed to carry an edict from the Red Temple, proclaiming Daenerys the chosen queen. They were caught sneaking through the fortress grounds at night, swiftly disarmed, and thrown out. Jon learned of these attempts through ravens, each time bracing for the possibility that Daenerys might be freed or might vanish. But nothing came of it. She seemed content, or rather resigned, to remain in her lonely confinement. Despite everything, life went on. Small joys sprouted in the capital. Couples married, children were born, markets bustled with what goods could be found. The gloom lifted slightly as the days lengthened. The fever outbreak in Flea Bottom subsided thanks to Sam's efforts, and the city held a small festival to celebrate midwinter. Jon made a brief appearance, offering a speech that sounded stiff to his own ears. Still, the people cheered him politely, some out of genuine gratitude for the peace, others because the presence of the king always commanded applause. In the swirl of these everyday matters, Jon sometimes found himself pining for the simpler life of the Night's Watch, or even the humble role of a steward at Winterfell. Kingship was a constant balancing act between compassion and severity, tradition and reform, caution and boldness. Each day demanded new decisions, new burdens. Many nights, he dreamed of the wide, snowy forests of the north or the quiet hush of Castle Black's ramparts. Waking, he would steel himself and face the day's tasks once more, driven by the sense that he must see it through, if only because no one else could or would in his stead. Spring arrived in slow increments. The snows around King's Landing melted, leaving muddy fields and new grass. Builders hammered away at damaged structures, though many of the city's grand towers remained half-ruined. Jon pushed for the reconstruction of the Dragon Pit, hoping to repurpose it as a grand meeting hall or perhaps a place of public gatherings. The name now carried a certain irony, with no living dragons left, but he thought it might stand as a reminder to keep ambition in check. Tyrion, for his part, tried to orchestrate an event that would mark a new era, perhaps a grand tournament to celebrate the peace. Jon resisted. The treasury was depleted, and the realm was in no mood for lavish celebrations. Tyrion argued that people needed hope and spectacle, something to believe in, but Jon ultimately refused. He would not spend coin on feasts and justs while so many starved. Nonetheless, attempts at normalcy persisted. Brienne of Tarth took on the duty of training new recruits to the Kingsguard, forging a more disciplined guard force than King's Landing had seen in years. Gendry traveled back and forth between the city and Storm's End, coordinating shipments of grain from the harvest in the Stormlands to feed the capital. Davos, ever diplomatic, navigated trade deals with the Iron Islands, exchanging goods in a way that might keep Yara Greyjoy's fractious region somewhat placated. Sam, exhausted from his work as Grand Maester, managed to preserve some time for the library, gathering knowledge from old scrolls in the Red Keep's dusty vaults. He hoped to rebuild the capital's archives, many of which had been burned or plundered. Jon wrote to Sansa often, exchanging updates on the realm's progress. She wrote back describing how Winterfell's granaries had been replenished thanks to a mild winter and that the North's scattered populations were slowly recovering. The rebellious houses abided by their agreement. Sansa requested that Jon visit soon, to reassure the lords of the North that their king still remembered them. Jon promised he would, once he was certain the capital could manage without him for a time. But just as the sun began to truly warm the stones of the Red Keep, trouble came from an unexpected quarter. A frantic raven arrived from the remote fortress near the Golden Tooth, penned by Ser Roderick himself. The letter was terse, the ink smudged as though written in haste. "Your Grace, I beg you come at once or send a trusted party. Daenerys Targaryen has vanished from her chambers. No signs of forced entry. No guard was harmed. It is as though she walked away. We have searched everywhere within and without the keep. There are hoofprints leading east, but we do not know with whom she might have fled. The men are uneasy. I fear what this may portend." At the bottom, scribbled hastily, "No sign of the Red Priestess, but rumors swirl that she was spotted nearby. We stand ready for orders." Jon read the letter twice, his pulse hammering. Daenerys was gone, apparently vanished into thin air. After all these months in captivity, after repeated unsuccessful rescue attempts, she had simply slipped away. The question burned in his mind. Did she leave willingly, or was she taken? And if willingly, to what end? Tyrion paced the council chamber upon hearing the news. "We should dispatch outriders immediately, scouring the roads east of the fortress. If she manages to reach sympathetic lords or sellswards, we could have a rebellion on our hands again." Davos, more cautious, asked, "Could it be that she simply chose a quiet exile, fleeing across the sea with a few followers? She might have no desire to start a war." Brienne frowned. "Even if that's true, there are many who might rally around her if they learn she's free. The realm is still so fragile. Another Targaryen rally could ignite civil war again." Jon's mind whirled. He recalled her bitterness, her sorrow, her vow that she had no fight left. But time changes people. Perhaps she had regained that old fire. Or perhaps she had been liberated by fanatics. He thought of the Red Priestess who had stood by her side in the final war. Could that woman have orchestrated a rescue? Finally, Jon shook himself. "We have to find her. I'll ride out at once with a small force. Tyrion, I'm leaving you in charge again. Davos, Brienne, gather enough men to search the roads, but not enough to alarm the local lords. Keep it quiet. We don't want the realm in a panic." Tyrion nodded, worry etched in his features. "Be careful," he said. "If she's truly out there, she might not be alone. The last thing we need is another open confrontation." Within hours, Jon set forth with a company of loyal men. He rode hard, pushing the horses despite the muddy roads. The sense of déjà vu struck him. Once again heading west, once again anxious about Daenerys' fate, once again uncertain of the realm's future. The countryside passed by in a blur of early spring green. They rested only as necessary, changing mounts at way stations when they could. Word had to travel faster than Daenerys, if possible. Upon reaching the fortress near the Golden Tooth, Jon found Ser Roderick in a state of dismay. The knight recounted the night of Daenerys' disappearance. She had been in her chambers at sundown, as usual. Guards had been posted, the same routine for months. Yet when the morning watch checked on her, they found the room empty, the window unlatched, and no sign of her within the keep. The door remained locked from the outside. The fortress walls had not been breached, and no external gate was opened. Yet footprints in the courtyard suggested 2 or 3 horses had been led out under cover of darkness. A rope had been found dangling from one of the lesser battlements, suggesting a silent escape. Whether by cunning or sorcery, it remained unclear. Jon's jaw tightened. Could she have bribed your men, or threatened them? Ser Roderick looked affronted. "We questioned everyone. None admit to aiding her. No bribe or threat. If so, she must have done it with the help of some outside party. Perhaps the Red Priestess, as we suspected." They searched Daenerys' chambers for clues, finding only a few personal items left behind. A half-finished book, a cloak of thick wool, a single lock of silver hair on the windowsill. It offered little insight. Some stable boys recalled hearing a whinny in the night but thought nothing of it. The hoofprints outside led eastward into the rolling hills, but a recent rainfall had washed away the trail beyond that. Jon stood in the courtyard, staring at the muddy ground, imagining her riding away under starlight. Where would she go? He assembled a handful of the best trackers in his force, instructing them to comb the roads for any sign of a small party traveling incognito. He also sent a sealed letter to the lords of the Westerlands, urging them to watch for any travelers matching Daenerys' description. Discreetly, of course. If word spread too widely, it might spark chaos. Days passed in fruitless searching. Jon led patrols himself, riding far into the surrounding countryside, questioning farmers and innkeepers, describing a woman with silver hair traveling with unknown companions. Some claimed to have seen a pale-haired woman days earlier. Others swore they saw two men and a hooded lady. But the descriptions were vague, contradictory. A merchant said he had glimpsed a red priestess buying supplies at dawn, but the trail went cold in a small hamlet where no one recalled seeing her. Bit by bit, each lead evaporated. At night, Jon lay awake on a straw pallet in a local manor, tormented by thoughts of Daenerys' possible plans. Did she intend to sail back to Essos and try once more to raise an army? Or was she simply fleeing a life of captivity, seeking anonymity? The realm balanced on a knife's edge, uncertain whether to fear or hope. He could not escape the gnawing sense of déjà vu, that their story was a cycle repeating itself, a tragedy that refused to end. After more than a fortnight of fruitless pursuit, he gathered his men for a final council. They had scoured dozens of miles, followed rumors into dead ends. She could have doubled back, heading north or south, or bribed a ship's captain at Lannisport. She might even be hidden in some remote holdfast. The possibilities seemed infinite. The men were exhausted, the horses nearly spent. They faced an uncomfortable truth. Daenerys was gone, and they might not find her in time to avert whatever she planned or didn't plan. Jon pressed on a few more days, but with every hour, the trail grew colder. At last, he reluctantly acknowledged defeat. He left a small group of loyal scouts behind, ordering them to keep their ears open for any new sign of the fugitive queen. Then he began the ride back to King's Landing, heartsick and uneasy. As they traveled, an old thought returned to him. History had a way of repeating itself, especially when it came to Targaryens and the Iron Throne. He had not wanted the throne, yet it had found him. She had wanted it, yet it had slipped from her grasp. Now she was free, adrift, and possibly with the Red Priestess at her side. Whether or not she would attempt to claim her birthright again, no one could say. But the realm would soon echo with the question, where is the Dragon Queen? He reached King's Landing weary and gaunt from the road. Tyrion greeted him in the courtyard with that old worried expression etched upon his face. No luck? The Hand asked quietly. Jon shook his head, dismounting stiffly. Tyrion sighed. Then we must prepare for the worst. Or perhaps it's the best, if she truly wishes only freedom. But we can't be certain. Over the next week, Jon convened council after council, plotting contingencies. If Daenerys surfaced in Essos, would she muster a new army? If she allied with Dorne, would the newly independent region become a launchpad for her ambitions? Or might she vanish into the east, never to return? They discussed stationing watchers at every major port, posting notices that she was wanted by the crown. But Tyrion pointed out that might turn her into a martyr or a rallying symbol. In the end, Jon decided on a middle course. Discreet watchers in major ports, a quiet reward offered for information, but no public proclamations that might incite panic. The last thing he wanted was mass unrest or fresh calls for her head. The realm was too fragile for that. He prayed that wherever Daenerys had gone, she did not intend to plunge Westeros into war again. Days slid into weeks and weeks into months. The Watchers reported nothing conclusive. Rumors abounded. Some said she had been spotted in Lys, recruiting mercenaries. Others claimed to have seen her in the wilderness near Harrenhal. A fisherman from the Stepstones insisted he had ferried a silver-haired lady to a secret cove, while a hedge knight in the Vale boasted he had glimpsed her crossing the mountains of the moon. None of these stories were confirmed. Many were obvious fabrications by those seeking attention or coin. Tyrion had them investigated, but each rumor ended in a dead end. Gradually, life resumed its rhythm. The small folk carried on, more concerned with their next meal or the next tax collector than with the fate of a vanished queen. Lords bickered, trade resumed, crops were sown and harvested. Jon found himself increasingly consumed by routine governance. Yet late at night, he would brood by a fireplace, recalling her face. He felt an ache of worry mixed with a strange emptiness. He had tried to save her from death, yet perhaps he had only delayed the inevitable conflict. Or perhaps he had doomed her to a more dangerous path. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the walls of King's Landing, Jon stood on a balcony overlooking the city. The smell of the Blackwater reached his nostrils, mingling with the pungent scents of the streets below. His cloak fluttered in a warm breeze. The capital L. Okayed almost peaceful in the twilight, lights flickering in windows, distant voices drifting up from the alleyways. He closed his eyes, imagining for a moment that the wars were truly over, that Daenerys had found a quiet corner of the world to spend her days in reflection, that the realm would not be torn apart again. He sensed a presence behind him and turned to see Tyrion, who had quietly approached. The hand studied him with that penetrating gaze. "We've heard another rumor," Tyrion said softly. "Some travelers from Pentos claim a Targaryen was seen boarding a ship there." Jon's heart lurched, but he kept his voice level. "Do we have any details?" "Sparse. The informants aren't reliable. They might be referencing some Targaryen pretender. Gods know there are always claimants out there. But I thought you should know." Jon nodded, facing the city once more. The fading sunlight played on his features, making him look older than his years. "Thank you," he said. "Let me know if you learn more." They stood in silence for a moment, the hush of a city on the cusp of night enveloping them. Tyrion cleared his throat. "Your Grace, I worry we're headed for a new crisis if she truly resurfaces. But maybe we'll get lucky. Maybe she just wanted freedom, as you said, and she'll stay far away." Jon's jaw tensed. Nothing about Dany was ever about hiding. "But I don't know who she is anymore. The war changed her. My betrayal changed her. She might return for vengeance, or not at all." Tyrion sighed. "I suppose we'll cross that bridge if we come to it. In the meantime, the realm remains." He glanced at Jon. "You're due in the throne room soon." A group of merchants from Volantis arrived, seeking trade concessions. "Shall we?" Jon bowed his head in acceptance. This was his life now, dealing with the endless swirl of politics and commerce, patching together a realm that still bore the wounds of repeated wars. He turned from the balcony, following Tyrion's careful stride back into the corridors of power. But in his heart, an unspoken question lingered. If Daenerys ever did come back, would he have the strength to face her again, or the will to stop her? That night, the city slept under a sky laden with stars, and beyond those walls, somewhere in the vastness of continents and seas, a silver-haired queen walked her own path, unbound and unknown. The winds carried whispers of her name, Daenerys Stormborn of House Targaryen. Some whispered in fear, others in hope. All knew that the realm would never truly escape the legacy of fire and blood she had left behind. And in that silent understanding, Westeros waited, bracing itself for whatever fate might come next.